Okay, we're going to begin. Let me mention that we are dedicating this shiur in the memory of Aryeh Leib ben Zimmel and also Shmuel Yitzchak ben Avraham, both of whom are at the time of their yortzeit. So we hope this learning will be an aliyat neshama for both of them. So this is Parsha Toldot. It's a fascinating Parsha and very power-packed. We're going to try to delve a little bit deeper, as we always do, into something that everybody has heard about and knows about, but maybe not to the extent that we're going to do this evening. The title, as we've always said, if you want to know what's happening in a parsha, the first place you go is you look at the title. And the title Toldot, which means generations. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. Here's a great trivia for you. You can stump some people on this. This is the only parsha in the entire Torah where all the avot are alive while the action, or at least some of the action, takes place in this parsha. Now you may ask, but didn't Abraham die in the last parsha? Well, we know that there is this principle, there is no ein mukdam u'muachar b'Torah, that we don't necessarily follow a chronological order. So if you were to do the math, you would see that Abraham is still alive when Yaakov is alive. So this is the only parsha where Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are all alive at the same time. So it's kind of emphasizing the title of this parsha, Toldot, generations, because all three generations are represented. Well, let's set the stage for this week's parsha, and I chose that expression purposely. This is a drama in 3 acts, the story of the birthright. It begins with the selling of the birthright. It continues through the giving of the birthright by Yitzchak, the bracha, and later on will play out in the confrontation and reunion between the twins, Yaakov and Esav. So we all know the story, but let's just play through it again so that we have a reminder of it. So it begins when the boys are only 13 years old. And they, in a sense, are starting to go their separate ways, as the Torah tells us that Esav is Ish Yodeat Said, Ish Sadeh, a man of the field, physical, a hunter. Yaakov Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. Yaakov is more of a homebody. By tradition, the dweller of tents means he studies Torah. And we're told right away that there is a schism between the affections of Yitzchak and Rivka. Yitzchak loves Esav, and Rivka loves Yaakov. Esav comes in from the field. He is Vuhu Ayef. He is tired. Most people, when they read this story, they think he must have been very hungry. Nowhere does it mention that Esav is hungry. He is tired. Perhaps we can say a word about that later. If he's tired, let him go to sleep. Instead, he is absolutely ravenous and wants to eat. And some have suggested he might be hypoglycemic because he's out in the field eating a lot of meat. That's a doctor's take on this parsha. And as we all know in the story, Yaakov is making some kind of lentil soup or porridge, whatever you want to call it. Esav wants it. Yaakov says, sell the birthright. And that's exactly what happens. Esav kind of throws up his hands and says, okay, I'll trade it for the bowl of lentils. And in a sense, he disdains the Bechorah, and the stage is set. comes later, of course, some time later. We're not sure exactly how many years later it is, but now it's time. It's interesting. Yitzchak is getting old. He's become blind. He is actually going to live another 60 years. So it's not like he's on his deathbed, but which is an important point here, that it's time to kind of designate someone to be the leader of the next generation, which is what all good leaders do. They make sure to groom someone who will take over for them, so there's continuity. And we know the story that Yitzchak prefers Esav, Rivka disguises Yaakov as Esav, the firstborn, and ultimately he gets that first bracha, although Esav gets a bracha as well. Maybe we'll say a few words about that too. So it's very, very perplexing what's going on here. If, as we usually say, Yaakov is literally pulling the wool over his father's eyes, I guess that's where the expression comes from, and he is through subterfuge gaining this bracha, and in a sense, deceiving the father, cheating the brother. What kind of role model is Yaakov for us? Is this really the person that we want to be our leader? Someone who's a sneak, who's deceptive, who resorts to underhanded methods to get what he wants? On the other hand, if he didn't cheat Esav, then why is it that later on in life, Yaakov will clearly suffer measure for measure? He deceived his father, and now his children later on will deceive him in the story of Yosef, when they too will use an animal skin to fake something for their own purposes. Just as Yaakov, after this parsha, will be separated from his parents for 22 years, so too Yosef will be separated from Yaakov also for 22 years. So that would seem to indicate that Yaakov is being paid back for something that he did, something wrong that he did. So either way, we have a problem. The second issue, when we look at the whole story of this selling of the birthright, is a birthright a real thing? Is it something that can be sold? In halacha, in Jewish law, we have a principle that you cannot sell davar shelo ba la'olam, something that hasn't even come into the world yet. For example, somebody says, in the future, I'm hoping to get enough money to buy a piece of property and build an apartment house, and I want you to sign a contract that you will take one of the apartments. Well, in Jewish law, this makes no sense. First, get the property, build the apartment house, and then we can talk about a contract. So this birthright, this bechora, is something that doesn't even exist. It won't exist for many years. So how can it technically be sold? So that's an important question in our discussion about what's going on in this parsha. Another question that all the commentators ask, and that is very logical, that how can you have a false, fraudulent sale that remains a sale? You go into a bank, you're disguised as somebody else. You look a little bit like them. You learn their signature. You tell the bank teller, I am so-and-so. You fake their signature. You take out money from the bank. And then later on, the real person comes and shows that I was never here. That's not me. That's not my real signature. Would we say that the person who took out the money can keep the money? No, we would go after that person and say, you disguised yourself and pretended to be somebody else and got this money under false pretenses, now you can't keep it. We have a principle in Jewish law also of what we call mekach taot, that when you have a fraudulent sale and you can prove that there was fraud, then the sale is absolutely withdrawn and you don't get to keep the money. So why is it that this bracha, which Yaakov gets seemingly by fraudulent purposes, he's allowed to keep it? In fact, Yitzchak will reaffirm after he sees that his real firstborn wasn't the one sitting there in front of him. He will reaffirm the blessing and say, Gam Baruchu. He will say to Esav, no, he gets to keep the blessing. Why? He should have said, and Esav should have said, this clearly was a fraudulent sale. Give it back to me. So we have to find a way to answer these questions and maybe have a different understanding about what's going on here in this famous classic tale of the birthright. We have to introduce into the plot and into the whole story the principal person here, and that, of course, is Rivka. She is the producer and the director of this entire episode, or you might say play. She has to somehow steer Yitzchak, her husband, in the right direction. As we saw earlier with Sarah, she has a greater intuition and insight into the future. And in the Parsha sheet, I talk about this, and I mention that a little bit more about the story of Rivka, that she's concerned and she's aware of what the future holds. And that's what's driving her. She's street smart. Remember that she grew up in the house of the con men, of Lavan, of Betuel. She can smell a con when it's there. And she realizes that although Esav does have some good qualities, the chief among them being showing tremendous honor to his father, Kibud Av, nevertheless, she understands he's not leadership material, at least not spiritual leadership material. And she needs to make sure that doesn't happen. Her problem is that Yitzchak clearly prefers son Esav over Yaakov. We said that, the pasuk says it very clearly. So something has to be done to change Yitzchak's mind and to understand that the person you want as leader is not Esav. And it really should be done of his own free will, because if it's not done of his own free will, and if it's completely fraudulent, as we said before, then it's not going to hold water. Then Esav will absolutely have a good case to come and say, Dad, you were tricked, you were fooled, call off the sale. It's a mekach taut. It's a fraudulent transaction that you don't have to abide by at all. The pasuk that, and I want to just read it to you, describes exactly what's going on here. Because, and if you read the text, you see it. Rivka hears that Yitzchak is preparing to give Esav the bracha, and he's going to go out and he's going to get a good steak for his dad, the kind of get in the mood. And Yitzchak was a lover he was a carnivore, a lover of meat. And the pasuk says very clearly that Rivka hears what Yitzchak is saying and tells to Esav beno, Esav his son. And it doesn't say their son. And it's Rivka hearing it. And the pasuk is telling very clearly that Esav is primarily Yitzchak's son, not hers. But when it comes to Yaakov, Rivka Amar El Yaakov Benah. Rivka now speaks to Yaakov, her son. So the text makes no bones about this. That maybe got a steak with a bone, but makes no bones about this. That clearly one parent favors one twin and the other. So Rivka, and this is a brilliant commentary by the great leader of German Jewry, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who also is plagued by these questions. How can it be a real sale? How can a fraudulent sale be upheld? How can somehow Rivka make Yitzchak see the light and bless Yaakov of his own free will? And so he says that Rivka stages an elaborate play. Forget about whether the Bechorah is really sold. Forget about whether it was obtained under fraudulent conditions. That's not happening here. She is staging this whole very elaborate scenario whereby Yaakov disguises himself as Esav, and Yitzchak gives, quote unquote, a blessing. But then when Esav comes in and Yitzchak realizes that this is not the person I thought it was, and he says to himself, if I am fooled now, because I thought that Yaakov was Esav and Esav was Yaakov, then maybe I've been fooled all my life. Maybe all this time that I thought Esav is such a good boy and Esav is leadership material, maybe indeed I have been misguided and mistaken. And this revelation comes upon Yitzchak. And at that point, he says, Gam Baruch Hu, he says to Esav, you know, I realize now what I never realized before. Perhaps we don't know the time frame. Perhaps he spends a long time thinking about it. But he comes to the realization that Rivka is correct. And therefore, this whole birthright, says Rav Hirsch, is really staged. And that's why in the very beginning, we get a clue to that, because in the first part of the story, when Esav wants to have this porridge, Yaakov says something very strange to him. Vayomer Yaakov michrach chayom et bechor chali. Sell me the birthright. It's translated today, but why doesn't it say hayom? Why does it say chayom? So, and that's clearly, it's not a printer's error, not a typo. Chayom here means like the day. It doesn't mean sell it to me today as if it's really effective and you can sell me something that years from now will be a reality. Chayom, we're pretending. We're two 13-year-old boys. We're play acting. We're role playing. If you could sell it to me, then would you? And this is where Yaakov understands that my brother really doesn't care about this whole birthright and Jewish leadership and continuity to the next generation. That's why he says Kayom and not Hayom. And that's why, even though you might think that Esav is hungry, and he was hungry, no question, he wolfed down that porridge, whatever it was. Nevertheless, the pasuk says twice that he's tired. And it doesn't mean necessarily that he's physically tired, because then the answer would have been, go lay down. You came in from the field, you're tired, take a nap. This is a different kind of tired. This is Esav being tired of the expectations placed upon him as the firstborn, that he's going to be the next spiritual leader. He doesn't want that. He's not interested in that. That's not his thing. And he's tired of perhaps his parents saying to him, you're the oldest, you're going to have to take over. You're going to wear the mantle of leadership. He doesn't want that. And that's what both Yaakov and Rivka understand. And therefore, they're part of this scheme in order to convince Yitzchak that Esav is not leadership material. So we don't have to worry about a fraudulent. It's not really a sale. It's not really selling something that doesn't exist now. It's all about getting Yitzchak to realize, Ke'ilu, if it could be sold, that it's not meant for Esav. And that's why it's very interesting. At the right immediately following this story, when Esav says, although he doesn't say it out loud, clearly, but Rashi says it's by Ruach HaKodesh, it's by divine inspiration that Rivka knows that Esav wants to kill Yaakov and is plotting to kill him and says, you've got to leave. But what happens at the end here? After the whole story of the Bechorah, and Yitzchak reaffirms that indeed Yaakov will keep it, Rivka says to Yitzchak, I am very grieved that perhaps Yaakov will marry one of the Hittite women, as Esav did, by the way, and that's not who he needs to marry. And she says, if he does, what good is life to me? She recognizes that the key to leadership, it may be acted upon by the husband, but the key is the wife. Without the good wife, as we say, right, behind every good man is an even better woman. And she realizes that. And so she has to get, again, Yitzchak to come to the same conclusion, but think it's his own. And not that she's telling him. Rivka's a little bit different than Sarah. Sarah is much more matriarchal and much stronger, to the extent that she tells Abraham, no, I don't care if you like Ishmael, he's out. Rivka doesn't quite have that sway over Yitzchak, or let's say that Yitzchak is not quite as prepared to listen to his wife as Abraham did. So she has to get Yitzchak to think, this is my idea. And indeed, that's exactly what he does. She herself said, I want you to go to, she said to Yaakov, I want you to go to Laban's house and live there. Make sure, you know, that you're away from Esav so he can't harm you, etc. But she has another reason too, and that's to find someone good to marry. And then what happens? She tells that to Yitzchak, and just as if it's his own idea, he says, I don't want you to take, Yaakov, I don't want you to take a wife from the Hittites. You go to Canaan and take a wife there. And he says, I want you to go and live with Lavan, which is exactly what Rivka had said, but now Yitzchak has to think that it's his idea. So that's exactly almost a proof to us that this is what's going on in the story of the birthright. Yitzchak has to come to the conclusion on his own, of his own free will, that Esav is not cut out to be the leader. And Rivka is the catalyst for all that happening. Now, we said before that indeed Yaakov will suffer and will have his own children fool him, etc. So that's not necessarily an indication, not necessarily that he did something so terrible. It just is what flows when you have to resort to these kinds of, I won't say fraudulent, but these kind of subterfuges to happen. There is a price to be paid. There are times that we do things that we know we have to do, but there's a price to be paid. And there are times that, you know, it may be punishing a child, and that hurts. And later on, you know, we may suffer for it, but it's something we knew that we had to do. And Therefore, even if there is a penalty attached to it, we have to do it. Sometimes you have to tell a lie for a better purpose, to save a life, to make shalom with somebody, but there may be a price to pay for it, because unfortunately, we didn't have a way to do it that was completely and totally pure. So that's kind of a postscript to this whole story. I want to add one more thought before we finish, and that is when we read the text, we don't read the text as clearly as we should. I've been saying for a long time, the lockdown was such a blessing in many ways that we didn't have to rush through the Parsha. If you stop to examine carefully one pasuk during the Torah reading in shul, you already basically missed half the Torah reading. We don't have that time, and that was a great thing to be able to sit. And Susie and I spent a long time going over the Parshiot. But when you look at the text of the birthright of the bracha of the Bechorah, right? Bracha, Bechorah, they're almost the same words, right? Same letters. And you see something very strange. It seems that both Yaakov and Esav essentially received the same blessing. There are two components to the blessing that Yitzchak gives. One component is what's called Tal Hashamayim, the dew of heaven. That the commentators say represents spiritual greatness. Shamayim is heaven, right? And Tal is water, is always connected to Torah. So this is spiritual greatness. The other blessing is Shmanei Haaretz, the fat of the land. Well, we know what that means. That means that you're wealthy, that you prosper. And both boys get that blessing. So Yitzchak complains, but when you look at the blessing which Yitzchak gets, that Yitzchak gives to Esav, the bracha says, this is pasuk lamed tet in the 27th chapter. Vayomer elav hinei mishmanei haaretz yeh moshevecha umital hashamayim me'al. He gives him both components. So what is Yitzchak? What is Esav complaining about? He got essentially the same thing that Yaakov got, right? If I will read for a second what the bracha is, Vayitein lecha Elokim mital hashamayim umishmanei haaretz. It's the same words. So what's he complaining about? But there is one difference. And if you look at the text, you'll see the difference very clearly. They get the same thing, but it's in a different order. In the primary bracha, Tal HaShamayim, the dew of heaven, comes first, and the second part of the blessing is the fat of the land. In Esav's case, it's reversed. They get the same thing, but it's in different order. What's the implication of that? The implication is that you can be a Yaakov or an Esav, and you can have both. You can be spiritually great. You can be wealthy. We don't have vows of poverty. We have, wanting to be modest in the way we live, but there's no, right, as Tevye said, right? It's no sin, right? It's no sin to be poor, but it's no great honor either, he said. And we believe that. But it's where your priorities and where the bulk of your character is that the order makes a difference. In Yaakov's case, he actually at one time certainly was extremely wealthy, but that was not his essential purpose or motivation or character. He was first and foremost meant to be a spiritual leader. And after that, he could be wealthy. As for Esav, it was a different order. He was someone who was destined to be materially successful and indeed to be a leader in terms of the world on a material level. He could also, in addition to that, have spirituality. but that wasn't going to be his primary character, his primary personality. And this is the message for the Jewish people, that our priorities and where we put our greatest strength and our greatest effort is to come closer to God and to be more spiritually perfect, more spiritually active, and less concerned with materialism. The rest of the world, they can also be spiritual, but primarily their strength is in materialism. And sometimes when we get that confused, we've really, in a sense, lost that blessing. When we think that number one priority and number one objective and mission in our life is to amass as much money as possible, as many material goods as possible, as opposed to collecting mitzvot and collecting acts of chesed, gemilut chasadim. That's really who we are. And therefore, in a sense, Esav realized this. And he understood that Yaakov was getting the better blessing because it was weighted more heavily towards the dew of heaven, the spiritual side. And that's perhaps the ultimate lesson that we all have to learn, that we live in a world that is so focused on materialism and on the amassing of things, but not necessarily on the what we'd call the invisible qualities, not the things which you can necessarily see or touch, but the things like integrity and honesty and compassion, and again, this idea of coming closer to God, because God is also invisible. And in a sense, I saw a poster that someone had, the most important things in life are the things you can't see. And there is something to that. So all in all, I think this story is so deep. We've just really touched the surface of it. But if we want to really talk about what our birthright is, then this is exactly the point that's being made at the end of the day, that the birthright is to maintain this continuity throughout the generations, to link the past to the future through us, so that we not only carry on this relationship with God, but we, in a sense, strengthen it and even perfect it until ultimately we have earned the right to achieve the Geula Shalema, the final and complete redemption. So if anybody has a comment or something you'd like to add, I know a couple of people put in something in the chat, and I'm happy to address it if anybody wants to contribute anything. If not, as I always say, I'll assume that you agree with everything I've said.
I have a question I haven't thought about before. What was Esav's reaction to Rivka after what happened?
Well, this clearly, Rivka is not only the hero of the story, but the victim, because Rivka, her very name includes the word ravak, which means single or alone. And she will, unfortunately, she will be devoid of both sons, because Yaakov will have gone away, and Esav, she doesn't have really, she herself, and by the way, it identifies, just as a postscript, since you asked that, there's an amazing Rashi. It identifies in Pasuk Hein at the end of this Sedra, it identifies Rivka as being Aim Yaakov Esav, the mother of Yaakov and Esav. And Rashi says, I don't understand why the Pasuk needed to say this. We know she's the mother of Yaakov and Esav, but I think the point is she never lost her love for her son Esav either, even though, of course, it would be very difficult after what happens for Esav to be close to her. So at the end of the day, Rivka will die alone. She's the only one of the avot or imahot whose death is not recorded in the parsha. And one of the reasons for that is all the others are recorded, but hers isn't. One of the reasons is because it was embarrassing that there was nobody at her funeral. The only person at her funeral, say the commentators, was the gravedigger, because Yitzchak was blind and he didn't go, and Yaakov had already run away to Lavan, and Esav didn't go either. So she is really in this whole tradition of the self-sacrificing noble women who give up so much for the good, for the general good of the nation. And she's certainly an example of that. So she really does pay the price, but she felt this is something I had to do ultimately for the good of the people. Okay, so a lot to think about, and hopefully you'll have a chance to spend some time with this parsha. It's one of the great classic parshiot of the Torah, but all the stories coming up in Bereshit and Shemot are really just amazing stories that we're trying to look a little bit deeper into. So thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks for coming to this new time of 6 o'clock, and stay tuned. There's always a copy. If you've missed any of these Parsha shiurim, you can get them on YouTube. If you can't find it, just send me a WhatsApp or an email and I will send you a copy of it. We always have a copy, and it's also on the Ohel Ari website in the library. So if you missed any, by all means, you're welcome to look up some of the previous ones. Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Stay safe. Stay healthy.
Shabbat
We'll see you
Shalom,
guys
and
next
thanks
time.
very much.
Bye.